Hello and welcome to our third and final lecture on music of the Renaissance. This lecture will be on secular music of the Renaissance. So let's review again our distinction between sacred and secular music. This definitely applies to both the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Sacred music is music that has something to do with religion, usually performed as part of a religious service, like the Mass, or maybe the motet might not necessarily be in a religious service, but it's still definitely sacred because the subject matter has to do with God, religion, worship, what have you. And on the secular side, of course, secular music has nothing to do with church. It's music for entertainment, or maybe instrumental music for dance, and we'll see some examples of that today. Another important distinction, by the way, and again, this is true for both the Middle Ages and mostly the Renaissance. I'll explain why it is mostly true in the Renaissance. But secular music will have a text in whatever locally understood language is prevalent, right? So if we're talking about in Italy, it's Italian. If it's France, it's French. In England, it's English. But sacred music is always going to be in Latin. Unless we are getting towards, let's say, the later Renaissance and the Reformation has taken place, right? And one of these churches has broken away from the Catholic Church and no longer adheres to that doctrine of only Latin in church. Remember, Latin was the official language of the Catholic Church right up to the 1960s. So any medieval church music is going to have a Latin text, like the Mass or like Gregorian chant, or as we get into the Renaissance Mass or the motet. All of the examples of sacred music that we have looked at have been in Latin. Now, I did put as sort of a bonus listening as an attachment to my announcement and in my comments of my lecture on sacred music of the Renaissance. I put an example of an English motet. Actually, in the English language, that would sometimes be called an anthem, which was in the English language, right? This was the New Commandment, and that was in English. But remember, in England, after the Reformation, we have the Church of England, created by Henry VIII, and the Church of England has the vast majority of its services, especially as time goes on, is in English, so that the Book of Common Prayer is in the English language. Similarly, in the Lutheran Church, this was a very important sort of doctrinal point of Luther's, that the common people should have a direct relationship with God. They shouldn't have to go through a middleman, a priest. That's why there are no Lutheran priests. There are ministers, but there are no priests. And therefore, you should read the Bible yourself, which means maybe it's a good idea to learn how to read if you didn't already, so that you can read the Bible yourself and understand it yourself, maybe with guidance from a minister, but you should read it yourself. And that the music, and in fact the service of a Lutheran church should be in German. If you're in Germany, it should be in a language that people can understand. And the music will also be the music of the Lutheran Church, as we will especially see when we get later into the Baroque era, and when we talk about J.S. Bach, who was a Lutheran Church musician. All of the music of the Lutheran Church is, of the German Lutheran Church, is in German. So it is less true as we get past the Reformation in the Renaissance. It is less true that all sacred music must be in Latin. If we're talking about Catholic sacred music, it definitely still is in Latin. But the Catholic Church isn't the only game in town anymore, so just kind of bear that in mind. But of course, any of the examples which I will have as part of your listening ID, if they are secular, they will be in a vernacular language. like French or English, whatever. If they are sacred, they will be in Latin. And if you don't hear any words at all, then it's probably some example of instrumental dance music, like the estampillé, which we learned about, again, back in the Middle Ages. Okay, so secular music of the Renaissance. Let's just sort of touch on some of the points that the book makes. This is starting on page 88 in the 2025 release of the Kamian text. It says, during the Renaissance, secular vocal music became increasingly popular. Secular everything becomes increasingly popular. That's one of the characteristics of the Renaissance, right? Of Renaissance humanism. Begins really in the late Middle Ages. I talked about the increasing secularism, especially of the last century or two of the Middle Ages. And that's paving the way for the Renaissance, which is a time of greatly increased secularist, humanist attitudes on life. What do we mean by that? Meaning that people were not so kind of consumed with or obsessed with the afterlife as being the only time which matters. And that human life here on earth was worth celebrating, was worth enjoying, was worth spending your time learning about things, being curious about things, right? Reading in books about things, cultivating skills, like learning to read or learning to recite poetry, learning to sing, to play an instrument, to dance, what have you, right? So again, this is something that begins really with the nobility back in the latter half of the Middle Ages, but it's becoming more and more popular. And it's even becoming popular among, say, wealthy, prosperous non-nobles, right? People who are commoners. But, there were some commoners, that is, non-nobles, who were quite wealthy. Just as I think I made the point a couple lectures ago, that there were noblemen who were impoverished. They were of the nobility, but they didn't have any money, right? There were nobles who fell on hard times, bad luck, whatever. But then there were also very prosperous non-nobles, especially people like, certain craftsmen or merchants or bureaucrats or lawyers, people like this, physicians, people who had a skill or a trade. And those people, increasingly, they also want a taste of this culture, and they want their children to become educated, have a better life than they. This is really, again, it's part of the Reformation. You've probably heard of something called the Protestant work ethic. It's not that Catholics aren't also hardworking, but the idea that you can work and improve yourself and make something of your life and improve your situation, right? This is an idea, again, it's one of these ideas that we kind of take for granted now, hopefully, that your life is what you make of it, and the possibilities are endless if you sort of put your nose to the grindstone, and if you are diligent and hardworking, your life can be improved. Even if you are from fairly low circumstances, you can have. That is an idea that was practically unknown in the Middle Ages for, again, 1,000 years. And that attitude was, well, wherever you are in life, that's where you were born, that's where you're going to stay, that's where your grandfather and his grandfather before him were, so you better get used to it. Just resign yourself to that fact, because your life's going to be over before you know it anyway, and the only thing that matters is the afterlife, so just keep your soul in good order. So we have a very different attitude in the Renaissance, right? And so it finds its expression most in, again, the secular world. Okay, so secular vocal music becomes increasingly popular. Throughout Europe, music was set to poems in various languages, including Italian, French, Spanish, German, Dutch, and English. So keep in mind that if we are talking about secular vocal music, it is almost always the case that the composer, the guy who writes the music, is not the person who wrote the words. The words are usually written by a poet, and they may exist just as a poem before a composer decides to set that poem to music. And as a result, many of these songs that we will learn about, like the madrigal or what have you, they basically follow the form of the poetry. So poetry, remember, has its own meter, it has its own form. And so that meter and that form is very often carried over into the music if that poem is set to music. The development of music printing helped spread secular music, and thousands of song collections became available. Again, the development of printing, I can't overstate how important that is. The comparison has been made many times, and it may even be an understatement to say that the printing press, right around the beginning of the Renaissance, was as revolutionary as the internet has been for our time. May end up being even more revolutionary. We'll see. The internet has only been around really for 30, 35 years, something like that. So we're still early into the internet age. And we'll see if it makes as dramatic an impact as printing may. But it affected so many things. It just made a sort of a synergy with this whole humanist and reformist within the church. This impulse, and it just made it music that much more widely available, because again, you can print music just as easily, if not maybe even more easily, than you can print words. So music proliferates. It's much cheaper to buy, to produce, which means it makes it worthwhile to learn how to read music. If you're a musician that, you could play an instrument, you could sing, but you didn't know how to read music, well, now it's worthwhile to learn how to read it, because you can learn so much more of it than the old method of simply memorizing it, having it be passed on by ear, and then you have to hold it in your memory. If you're reading something out of a book, you don't need to memorize it. You can carry it around in your book, So, of course, music was an important leisure activity. Every educated person was expected to play an instrument and read notation, right? Part of this, again, what I talked about 5 minutes ago, about like self-improvement, striving to better yourself. Or in the case of, if you were of the lower nobility, maybe striving to ingratiate yourself with the higher nobility, to become a courtier, right? Someone who is considered worthy to have around in the court of a wealthy, powerful nobleman like a duke or a king. One of the ways you would make yourself more attractive to be included into those circles is by making yourself a better musician and a good dancer, as we will see when we talk about dance music. It says here, Renaissance secular music was written for groups of solo voices and for solo voice with the accompaniment of one or more instruments. What do we mean, groups of solo voices? Isn't that a contradiction? Well, what we mean is you have a group of singers, but they are singing one to each vocal part. So, for example, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Whereas in a big choir, you might have a dozen people, at least big by Renaissance standards, a dozen people on each one of those parts. So a dozen sopranos, a dozen altos, a dozen tenors, a dozen basses. But the secular music of the time was more what we would consider chamber music, vocal chamber music, maybe meant to be performed in a smaller room, not a giant cathedral. There was really no such thing as a concert hall yet, but this is music to be performed in a more intimate setting with one person on each voice part. So a group of solo singers, with or without the accompaniment of instruments. Now, most of these madrigals, certainly the English madrigals, are a cappella. They're meant to be performed just by voices only. Some of the Italian madrigals might have instruments, and there are two different varieties of madrigal, by the way. There's the earlier Italian madrigal, beginning around 1520, and the later English madrigal after 1588. I'll talk about the difference. But first, I guess I should define what a madrigal is. As the book states, a madrigal is a piece for several solo voices set to a short poem, usually about love. So, love poetry set to music for the most part. I mean, there were some other subjects, but generally, I would say probably, 85 to 90% of these madrigals were love songs. And again, some of them were like unhappily ever after love songs, mopey, unrequited, unreturned love, or maybe, especially maybe more on the English side, um, a happier ending love song, more flirtatious often. We will see. I'm going to give an example, and I'll post it in the announcement, and I'll put a link maybe in the comments of this lecture. An example of some of this sort of sexual innuendo which you find in some of these English madrigals. Also, it's important to note that madrigals, particularly again, I think it's maybe more true of English madrigals, were meant to be sung by men and women together. This is not going to be the case in sacred music. Remember, sacred music within the Catholic Church was only to be sung by males because women were not supposed to sing in church because of what St. Paul wrote to the Romans about letting your women be silent in church, or make sure that women are silent in church. Women were not allowed, essentially, to sing in church, with the one exception of a nun in a convent was allowed to sing. But otherwise, women were not to sing in church. Therefore, that's where you get boy sopranos from. If you have a choir of soprano, alto, tenor, bass in a church for sacred music, the alto part would be boys. The soprano part would be boys. The alto part might be boys, or might be men who are countertenors, that is, who have trained their falsetto range, or what we call head voice, to sing an octave up. So if you are trained to do this, you can sing falsetto in a way that doesn't sound like weird and breathy, but is actually has a full tone, and you can control the transition from your chest voice to your head voiced falsetto. And we'll hear actually an example of a countertenor in this lute song, this secular lute song. But and then the tenors and basses, all male voices. Women were not supposed to sing in church. But on the secular side, men and women singing together, what could be more delightful, except maybe men and women dancing together, right? Which we'll get to. So mixed groups. By mixed, I mean mixed genders. A madrigal, it says here, like a motet, combines homophonic and polyphonic textures. But the madrigal uses word painting and unusual harmonies more often. So I'm going to give some examples of this. So first of all, you will hear in, I'm going to post a couple examples of madrigals, and you will hear at times that the different voice parts are very independent from each other. They had their own shape, their own rhythm. And that's what we call polyphonic texture, when we have multiple strands of melody in different ranges which are independent from each other and are considered more or less equal in importance to each other. But then I've also talked about homophonic texture, where we have one melody, usually the highest range, like in a group of singers, the soprano, and the other voices, they have their own lines, but they aren't really musically interesting lines by themselves. They are harmonizing with the melody. They are following the lead of the melody and really basically just creating chords. So as these musical lines, if you took a snapshot of them at any one place, you'd find a chord, probably a triad. And so that's really the function of the other voices, is to support the melody and provide harmonic background. That would be homophonic texture. Well, in these madrigals, we can go freely back and forth between more polyphonic, more homophonic. Some madrigals might be entirely polyphonic, some might be more homophonic in texture. It says here, the madrigal uses word painting and unusual harmonies more often than, for example, a motet, which is sacred. Remember, sacred music is more dignified and restrained in its character. There will be word painting in there, and in my lecture on sacred music, I pointed out some examples of word painting, but they're going to be much more subtle, much more difficult to detect. They're not going to be overly obvious. In secular music, this is part of the fun of this music, is that the word painting is very obvious, and it's sort of intentionally, even somewhat humorous, maybe, in its obviousness. We'll see an example of this. So it says here, the Renaissance madrigal originated in Italy around 1520 during a creative explosion in Italian poetry. So I guess we might remind you here, remember, the Renaissance really begins as a literary phenomenon. It begins in literature as the Italians especially are seeking to rediscover the literature of the ancient world in the original Latin or in Greek, and they are scouring libraries all over Europe to find this literature and translate it, whether it's poetry or dramas or scientific papers or philosophical works or whatever, anything that they can get their hands on in Greek and Latin. They are finding it, they are often printing it, right? With the development of printing. I talked about all this in the historical background lecture. But another thing that these poets and writers are doing is they are trying to do the same or even better in their own native languages. And again, this is something we see beginning in the late Middle Ages, where poets are trying to create epic works in their own language that will rival maybe the greatest works of antiquity in Latin, in Greek. So, for example, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy is in Italian. It's not in Latin. The Sonnets of Petrarch in Italian, right? Not in Latin. The Decameron by Boccaccio in Italian, not in Latin. We get to England, right? And we have like the Canterbury Tales. It's not really like a Greek and Roman. It's not, but it's an example of late medieval English literature. It's sort of like the English language coming into its own and taken seriously as a medium for great literature. And of course, this trend continues to Shakespeare, the epitome, the apotheosis of the English language. All by way of saying, keep in mind, Renaissance begins really with literature and then spreads to the other arts. And so we can see this in the book where they say there's around 1520. That's where this creative explosion in Italian poetry comes from. Madrigals were published by the thousands in 16th century Italy, where they were sung by cultivated aristocrats and members of the upper middle class. They mention the names of some of these Italian madrigal composers. I'm going to mention one in particular, Carlo Gesualdo, the Prince of Venosa, who is, first of all, his madrigals are really remarkable pieces of music because they are harmonically really far out, really chromatic, very colorful, using lots of the sharps and flats and strange twists and turns of harmony. They actually sound kind of like barbershop quartet, except in Italian. Gesualdo, unfortunately, is also most famous because he's the only one of the famous composers who is also a murderer. Poor Gesualdo, his wife was unfaithful to him. He suspected this. And so he told her that he was going to go out on a hunting trip one day. He said, I'm going to be gone for a couple of weeks. Me and the boys, we're going out hunting. See you later. And so he left the house, and his wife invited her lover to come stay a while since she knew her husband was going to be away. Gesualdo turned around, came back a day or two later, found the two of them together, and murdered them in his own bedroom. Was found not guilty, by the way. He was tried in court. Now, he was a prince, so maybe he got some special treatment, but also in those days, if you caught your wife cheating on you, apparently it was not considered a crime if you murdered her and her lover. So that's Gesualdo for you. So they mention here in 1588, the year of the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Big year in English history. The Spanish were attempting to invade England in their giant armada, hundreds and hundreds of ships. There was a storm. There were a series of mishaps. The armada was scattered. destroyed. The English took it as sort of like a sign from God that God was on their side, etc. Anyway, that very same year, a volume of translated Italian madrigals was published in London. This inspired a spurt of madrigal writing by English composers. And for about 30 years, there was a steady flow of English madrigals and other secular vocal music. So this collection was called Musica Transalpina. This is the name of a book, an anthology of Italian madrigal texts, just the poetry, not the notes. The Italian madrigal texts translated into English, and Musica Transalpina means music from over the Alps, across the Alps, which is where Italy is in relation to the rest of Europe. The Alps is that mountain range that kind of separates Italy from the rest of Europe. And this is what started the craze for madrigals in England. Now, eventually, English madrigals kind of took on their own character, but they were inspired by the Italian madrigals. And at first, English composers took those translated texts, began setting them to music, and then they created their own texts. And of course, this is the time of the Elizabethan Renaissance, the greatest period, perhaps, in English poetry and drama. Elizabeth herself was a beloved queen by her people and especially by the artists, the writers, the musicians of her time because she was such a great patroness of the arts. She lavished money on poets and playwrights and musicians and what have you. And they, in turn, appreciated her very much. And as a token of their appreciation, in the year 1601, a bunch of English madrigal composers got together and said, you know what would be really nice as a gesture to the Queen, especially now that she's getting on in years. Queen Elizabeth was about 60 by that time. We should put together a book of madrigals, a collection of madrigals, and every one of these madrigals will be about how wonderful Elizabeth is, and we'll dedicate the whole thing to her. And this is what they did. And this collection of madrigals by English composers to honor Queen Elizabeth is called the Triumphs of Oriana. Oriana is sort of a pet name, a code name for Queen Elizabeth herself. She was sometimes known as Oriana. So this madrigal by Thomas Weelkes, which is in your, it has a listening guide there embedded in your text, is included in that collection. And all it is, it's basically an elaborate metaphorical tribute to Queen Elizabeth, with lots of text painting to illustrate the scene being described in the words. So let's look at these words because they might be a little bit confusing at first. As Vesta was from Latmos hill descending, she spied a maiden queen, the same hill ascending. So Vesta is the Roman goddess of basically the home and the hearth. And probably a couple other things. Vesta, you might be familiar with the Vestal Virgins, who were the priestesses of Vesta back in the days of the Roman Empire. You can still see the ruins, by the way, of the Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum. The Vestal Virgins, famously, if they broke their vow of virginity as priestesses to Vesta, they were punished by being buried alive. Anyway, so Vesta, Roman god, is descending Latmos hill, which is a hill in Greece, I believe, but never mind that. She's going down a hill. And she's followed on by her attendants, her entourage, because of course she's a goddess. You know, she doesn't just walk around alone. She has a whole sort of troop of followers, as does this maiden queen, Elizabeth, of course, walking up the same hill. So Vesta's going down, Elizabeth is going up. And as their paths cross, the entourage of Elizabeth, which apparently consists of shepherds and nymphs, well, they are joined by the entourage of Vesta because Vesta's followers decide that the grass is greener on the other side, and this maiden queen, Queen Elizabeth, is so wonderful, they are going to abandon their goddess and follow Elizabeth back up the hill. So again, it's just a way of saying, Elizabeth, you are so wonderful, you are even more magnificent than a Roman goddess. And so it's just sort of describing the scene. Now, as this events unfold, everything is described very obviously in the music. So on the word descending, we have a descending scale. In fact, we have like cascades of descending scales as each of the different voice parts in turn descend sort of in a staggered way. And then same thing on the word ascending, except they're going up instead of down. On the words running down, again, a sort of tumbling downward scale figures in each of the different voice parts. And then on the words 2 by 2, we isolate two voices singing the words 2 by 2, and then 3 by 3, three voices. Together, on the word, just the word together, all the voices are singing together. Leaving their goddess all alone. On the words all alone, it's suddenly a solo voice. All alone, singing this sad, descending 3-note pattern. And leaving their goddess, hasted thither, and mingling with the shepherds of her train, with mirthful tunes, her presence entertain. Then sang the shepherds and nymphs of Diana, long live fair Oriana. And in fact, the last half of this song, this madrigal, is just the words, long live fair Oriana, over and over and over again. It's just, again, elaborate praise for Queen Elizabeth. I'm going to also include one other example. I'll have a link to it in my playlists, and I'll maybe post it right here in the announcements and in the comments to this lecture. I wanted to include another example of a very popular madrigal, English madrigal of the time, and that is Now is the Month of Maying by the composer Thomas Morley, right around this same time. And I'm including this one because, first of all, it's very similar to a song that you guys already know, which is Deck the Halls. Deck the Halls is definitely in the style of an English madrigal. I'm not sure the origins of Deck the Halls, but whoever wrote it, whether it goes back that far or not, I kind of doubt it, but it's deliberately in that style. Many of these English madrigals have these fa la 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 nonsense syllables, and that is the case with Now is the Month of Maying. And the words, remember how I said here that there's mention of shepherds and nymphs. All of this is, again, you very often find in English poetry or Italian poetry of the time, or, it's probably all over Europe, but certainly in these madrigal songs, there are often references to the outdoors, being out in nature, frolicking in the woods and the fields with the shepherds and the nymphs. What's up with that? Well, that's basically like code for men and women enjoying the pleasures of the flesh outdoors, because this is a time when the notion of privacy inside a house was almost unknown. That people did not have the idea of like a right to privacy, or of even having a place to be private, right? Which means that if you wanted to do the kind of thing with your lover that you would normally do in private, the only way to get away from people was to go outside, really. So you find lots of references, and they might be sort of tongue-in-cheek or hidden references or encoded references, but that's what all this shepherds and nymphs stuff is about, or references often to the outdoors, being in the fields, in the woods. Oh, how wonderful it is being out in the fields and the woods. Yes, nature imagery is all over the place in poetry, and it's nice to be outside on a nice day, but it's all but explicit. I mean, it's implicit. But in this, the words of Now is the Month of Maying, which are fairly easy to understand because it's in homophonic texture. Now is the month of Maying, when merry lads are playing, fa la 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 la. merry lads are playing, each with his bonny lass upon the greeny grass. So it's May, it's the month of May, and we've been cooped up inside all winter, but now it's May, the grass is green, the lads, the merry lads, and their bonny lasses are out in the grass doing you know what. There's a reference in the second verse to this game called Barley Break, which is sort of like a bocce, or it was a game that was popular back then, sort of like, yard bowling or whatever, lawn bowling. But they're not really talking about playing bocce. They're talking about playing something else out on the grass. So sort of a cheeky, bawdy example, which again was common in English madrigals of the day. These kind of tongue-in-cheek references, or wink and a nod references to outdoor activities. Okay, so that's the madrigal. I'm going to move on to the lute song now quickly. What is the lute? The lute is, you can see a picture of one here. I'm not sure how anatomically correct that lute is, but it's close enough. The lute is basically what the Renaissance musicians had in place of the guitar. It's a little different from the guitar. The guitar has a flat back, whereas the lute has a rounded back. The lute has usually a shorter neck, but more strings. Comes in various different sizes, but it was the sort of all-purpose portable instrument for singer, songwriter, performers. And there were, of course, pieces composed for solo lute, and then there were songs composed for singer and lute. And you could either be the lute player accompanying the singer, or if you were skilled on both, you could sing and accompany yourself on the lute. And so the Renaissance lute song was widely cultivated from the late 1590s to the 1620s. And the greatest of these lute song composers was John Dowland. John Dowland had this image that he cultivated of sort of a sensitive, mopey, always sad, kind of lovesick soul. Whether that was his real personality or something that he sort of cultivated as a performer is hard to know exactly, but that's what his songs were like. They were very often kind of like mopey, sad songs, and this song is, which they include as an example, is no exception. So this song is "Flow My Tears," composed right around 1600. This was the most popular song in the English language for easily 100 years or so after its composition. If you go to the Wikipedia article on "Flow My Tears," there's all kinds of information about it, all the different references in culture and the different arrangements that were made and how it found its way into other pieces of music. And this song, like the madrigal we just talked about, also has a lot of text painting, but here there is one main musical feature that serves as the basis for all of the text painting, and that is this descending four-note pattern, which you can see in the book. On page 90, they put brackets around it. Interestingly, that four-note pattern, it appears twice in succession in the very beginning of the song and other places throughout. And the rhythm is almost exactly augmented or doubled in the second phrase. So each of the note values is almost exactly doubled, which is kind of an interesting compositional technique. It also makes it so that the second phrase begins on an upbeat instead of the downbeat, syncopation. That is, the beginning of the phrase is at a place where we don't necessarily expect it. Right? Anyway, this descending four-note pattern, as we will see when we talk about the text, Dowland finds all these different ways to make use of this idea of something falling or descending. Now, what's interesting about this song is apparently Dowland composed it first just for solo lute. It was an instrumental piece, and then later he added the words. And we're not even really sure who wrote the words. It could have been Dowland himself. It's possible. But again, it's more likely that it was a poet. It was usually the case that composers did not write the words to their own songs. They used the words written by a poet. But whoever wrote these words, it's just a marvelous poem, just on its own, even without the music. So let's look at, before we talk about the words, let's talk about the form of this piece. And as is often the case with these listening guides, I'm going to hold the book up, but you have this in your book. The listening guide, first of all, gives you the time, if you're following the tracks, when something happens, and then an outline of the form. So we have, in this case, an A section which is repeated, a B section which is repeated, a C section which is repeated, okay? And then maybe some features of the music, like what's going on in the notes, and the text while all this is happening, right? In this case, we have sort of a three-part form. We have an A, B, and C section. That's what gives us our variety. We have three different sections, but each one of those musical sections repeats once. So that's what gives us our continuity. Remember, form is basically trying to strike a balance between repeating things for the sake of cohesion and fostering a sense of familiarity, continuity. But of course, we can't just repeat the same thing over and over again. We get bored, so we need some variety. So we have three different sections, but they each repeat once. This form, by the way, this is really a musical form, not a poetic form necessarily. Because remember, this was an instrumental piece first, before Dowland added words to it. And this is the form that it's in, actually, is of a Renaissance dance called the pavane. The pavane was a slow, sort of sad, stately kind of dance, almost a funereal kind of dance, if you can imagine dancing at a funeral. It has this mournfulness about it. And it generally would be in that form of an A, B, and C section, each section repeating. Notice the relationship of the words to the musical form. So each time the music repeats, like the A section repeats, we have different words. Then we go to the B section. Now we have different music, different notes, but when it repeats, the words are different. This pattern starts to become predictable, right? A, words. A, music repeats, words are different. B, words. B, music repeats, words are different. When we get to C, we have the same music and the same words in both iterations of the C section. And as I said, the words are full of this very rich imagery of loss and despair. It's someone... Now, it doesn't go into the details of why his life, whoever this person is, this character of the song, John Dowland himself, or his persona, his artistic musical persona, for some reason has suffered some kind of tragic downfall, and now he is lamenting his fate. And he sings, "Flow, my tears, fall from your springs." So again, falling, the falling of tears, that four-note descending motive. "Flow, my tears, fall from your springs, exiled forever." So this is kind of an interesting poetic image. Who thinks of tears as they fall? They're being exiled from your eyes. Sort of like someone being outcast, as this character feels outcast from the world and from his former good fortune. "Let me mourn where night's black bird her sad infamy sings. There let me live forlorn." So again, let me mourn, let me be sort of cast away to the blackness of night where this sad bird sings her sad songs. That's where I'm going to live forlorn. So having introduced this image of night and of this black bird, the next verse, "Down, vain lights." So now instead of something physically falling down, it's the night coming down, or the lights coming down. "Down, vain lights, shine you no more. No nights are dark enough for those, like me," the singer, John Dowland, "for those that in despair their lost fortunes deplore. Light doth but shame disclose. In other words, I want to be in darkness, because if there were light, that light would illuminate nothing but my shame. And then we move into the B section. Never may my woes be relieved. I will never feel relief from my woe, since pity is fled. And tears and sighs and groans my weary days of all joys have deprived. And repeat of B. This is my favorite verse. From the highest spire of contentment. So picture a church spire, very common sight in Renaissance Europe. From the highest spire of contentment my fortune is thrown, and fear and grief and pain for my deserts. In other words, I deserved, these are my, and again, doesn't say why, it doesn't say what the source of all this sorrow and despair is, but and fear and grief and pain for my deserts are my hopes, since hope is gone. That's all I can hope for, since hope is gone, are fear and grief and pain. And then finally, the last verse, which is repeated, hark, you shadows that in darkness dwell. So again, this theme of darkness and being in shadows. Hark, you shadows that in darkness dwell. Learn to condemn light. Happy, happy they that in hell feel not the word's despite. So, he's saying those who are in hell are happier than those like me who feel the world, who are here in the world, but feel its despite, its spite, its whatever. Okay, so very, very dark, very sad song, and the text painting, the musical attempts to depict all of this woe and misery are there for the listener. Just as an aside, and I'll include a link to this again in the announcements, this song and several other songs by Dowland was recorded by Sting. I don't know if you've heard of Sting, the lead singer to the Police, very, very popular band in like the 80s, 90s, later had a solo career. Sting actually recorded a bunch of these songs with the lutenist Paul Odette, really the greatest lute player probably in the world. Now, when Sting sings it, he doesn't sing it in that high countertenor voice that you will hear in the recording of John Dowland. That's a man singing in that falsetto range, that countertenor range. Sting sings it in his own range, basically like down an octave in his own style, but he does sing it with just a lute in the background. And so I'll include a link and you can sort of compare and contrast the two. But I think it's interesting that Sting took an interest in these songs, and even though that is not at all what we would associate with him, music from 400 years ago. Okay, moving on very briefly to instrumental music. So, touching on what the book says, again, page 93, though still subordinate to vocal music, so not as important as vocal music, which we've already made the case many times, instrumental music did become more important during the Renaissance. More people learning to play instruments, more instruments being built, more music printed now for instrumentalists. So meaning it's worthwhile if you are an instrumentalist to learn how to read music. There's more music available. It's much cheaper, which means it's easier to play with other people as long as you're all reading from the same book. You don't have to have memorized the same tunes by some coincidence because you were only taught by ear, right? Having printed music makes everything easier and better. However, during the Renaissance, most instrumental music was going to be in one of two categories. Either it was pre-existing vocal music, like madrigals or songs or even motets that were arranged for instruments, right? So instrumental arrangements of previously existing music, or it was instrumental music to accompany dancing. And that's what we have an example of. Remember, dancing in this time is one of these things like that made you a well-rounded person, like learning to sing or learning to play an instrument, learning to write and recite poetry. dancing is hugely important in like higher society. For one thing, then as now, that's where you go to meet people of the opposite sex, and it's the importance of it cannot be overstated. Remember also, this is a time when dancing was not just sort of like, there's music playing, you go out on the dance floor and you move around in a funky way and express yourself. No, you had to learn precise steps to many different dances because dancing was done in groups and everyone was dancing the same, choreographed dance with certain prescribed steps. And if you messed up and bumped into somebody because you didn't know the steps, I mean, never mind if you were awkward and not graceful. Not only did you have to be as graceful as possible in your motions, you had to know the dance, because if you didn't, you would make an ass of yourself and you'd never get invited to the dance again, and you would not be included in those social circles where dancing was so important, right? So dancing is important, and it's important to have good music to accompany the dance, good musicians. Many of these dance pieces were in pairs. Composers like to compose, let's say, a slow dance followed by a faster dance, and they were composed as a two movement piece where one was meant to follow the other, and they might be composed in the same key and maybe with even some similarities of melody, but obviously one would be slower and maybe in a different meter, and then the next one might be faster. So these dance pairs were very common. So for example, the pavane and galliard. The pavane was a slower dance. It was often followed by the galliard. Or the passamezzo and saltarello. Now, what we have actually as an example, now I don't think this one is in your listening, but I will put it in, if I can, I'm pretty sure I'll be able to find this, and I'll put it in my playlist. But since it doesn't have a listening guide and it's not embedded in your text, I don't think this one would appear on a listening exam question. But this is a passamezzo and galliard. So a passamezzo is a medium step. That's literally what it means. Passa means step, and mezzo means medium. So a medium tempo dance. And a galliard is a faster, livelier dance. And this particular dance pair, again, sort of like a two-movement set, meant to be performed one after the other, was by Pierre Carobel, but it was included in this very famous anthology, again, collection of dance music called Terpsichore, named after the muse of the dance, or the muses, these Greek goddesses who sort of inspire artists and writers. There was one for each of the different arts, and Terpsichore was the muse of the dance. Notice again all these references to the Greek and Roman world, which we find even in the title of this collection of dance music, which we see references to in the madrigal as Vesta was descending. Who was Vesta? A Roman goddess, right? So all this love of the ancient world, keep that in mind as a common thread throughout the Renaissance. That's the thing that is being reborn in the Renaissance consciously, an attempt to, first of all, appreciate and then maybe imitate and maybe even exceed the great accomplishments of the ancient world. So anyway, we have these two dances. The instruments are not really specified for this dance music very often. It's just the tune is written out, and whatever instruments you have handy, whatever instruments you might have in your instrumental workshop, like in this illustration that's included in your text. This is a woodcut of the instrument room of the Emperor Maximilian in the early 1500s, the Holy Roman Emperor. And you can see lots of, familiar looking instruments. Many of them have slightly different names because they are the predecessors of the modern version. So you see something that looks like a trombone there sitting on that drum. That's called a sackbut. The Renaissance trombone is called a sackbut. You have a viol sitting on a table back there in the background. The viol is basically just sort of like the predecessor of our modern violin or viola. You can see an organ there. There's a guy playing the harp, etc. So all of the modern instruments, their forerunners, really start to develop in the Renaissance. And the book lists a lot of the names of these predecessor instruments, cornets, shawms, recorders, whatever. I'll just clue you in right now. I'm not going to. That's a level of detail I wouldn't expect on a test. But just do understand that instrumental music does become more important, although it's still not as important as vocal music. That's going to change in the next era that we get to. As we will see over the course of the Baroque, which is the next era, instrumental music, this is really the age when instrumental music comes into its own and eclipses, to a large degree, vocal music. But in these days, it was just like whatever you happen to have handy, bring it along, and we'll bring our book of dance music, and we'll accompany the dance. There was no such thing as sort of like the standard orchestra that we have today. Okay, that's going to wrap it up for the Renaissance, and therefore the Middle Ages and Renaissance, since we're covering them on the next test as one unit. So good luck on that test, and we'll see you next time for an introduction to the Baroque era.